September 2003. Christopher Galvin is 53 years old, and he is carrying a cardboard box out of the building his grandfather built. The board voted him out that morning, not with ceremony, not with gratitude. A vote, a statement, a press release. Done. The building around him is a monument. 2.6 million square feet of glass and steel spread across the Illinois prairie, the largest corporate campus in the state. At its peak, 25,000 people came through these gates every morning. Engineers, designers, the people who invented the world's first commercial cellular phone, the world's first clamshell handset, the walkie-talkie that helped win a world war. His grandfather Paul Galvin started all of this with $565 and a prayer in 1928. And his grandfather's company was worth $45 billion when Christopher took over in 1997. It is worth $12 billion today. He built the phones that everyone wanted. He just didn't build the right one. Was it the cost of carrying a dynasty on your back, or the price of forgetting that dynasty's fall? Did you ever own a Motorola? Maybe a razor you flipped open 100 times a day, a StarTAC that felt like the future, or a pager clipped to your belt before cell phones took over. I'd love to know which model or what you remember about it. Share it in the comments. Now, let's begin. The idea was not technically new. Attempts to install radio receivers in automobiles stretched back to the early 1920s. The problem was always the same. Vacuum tubes shattered from road vibration. Static from the ignition system drowned out the signal, and the antennas were impractical. Wires strung along the outside of the vehicle like the car was dressed for a parade. Installation required a mechanic, hours of work, and skill that most automobile owners did not possess. By 1929, a handful of small companies had produced car radios that more or less worked. Paul Galvin had seen them at industry conventions. He had also seen how expensive they were. $130 in a country where a new Ford cost $500, in the middle of a depression that was eliminating discretionary spending from American family budgets. Galvin understood something the other manufacturers missed. The obstacle wasn't technical, it was economic. The wealthy could always buy expensive luxury items, but the American middle class, the factory worker, the office supervisor, the traveling salesman, spent more hours in their car than the wealthy did. If you could build a car radio that a working family could afford, you could sell it to the entire country. His chief engineer at the time was a 27-year-old named William Lear. Yes, that William Lear who would later design and build the Learjet. Lear and a young technician named Elmer Wavering built a prototype car radio in 1930 that worked, intermittently, with encouragement, on a used Studebaker. And Galvin drove it to the Radio Manufacturers Association convention in Atlantic City in June 1930 and demonstrated it in the parking lot, which was the only exhibition space he could afford. He had no booth. He had a car. The orders came anyway. He named the product Motorola, combining motor, for the automobile, with Ola, a popular suffix of the era borrowed from the phonograph, the Victrola. The word was modern and memorable. It sounded like movement, like the future arriving on 4 wheels. The Motorola Model 5 T71 sold for between $110 and $130 installed. Paul Galvin sold the concept by arguing that the car radio transformed dead commuting time into entertainment, that it made the automobile not just transportation, but a living room on wheels, a connection to the wider world while you drove through it. He was not wrong. He was, in fact, 30 years ahead of how American culture would eventually describe the car as media environment. In 1930, Galvin Manufacturing sold $287,000 worth of Motorola radios. In 1931, revenue doubled. In 1932, doubled again. The Depression killed businesses around them, and Paul Galvin was expanding. He didn't do it by luck. He sold on quality when competitors sold on price, invested in research when competitors cut expenses, and drove through Chicago at night tuning his radio, pulling over to call engineers when the signal broke up, demanding solutions by morning. By 1936, the company had moved to a larger factory at 4545 West Augusta Boulevard in Chicago. They had expanded into home radios, police radios, and specialized communications equipment. Revenue exceeded $5 million a year, and in that same year, Galvin's engineers demonstrated the first practical two-way radio, small enough to be carried by a single person. They called it the handy-talkie. It was large, heavy, required a backpack battery, and had a range of about 1 mile. But you could talk to someone who wasn't near a wire. You could coordinate across a factory floor, a city block, or a battlefield without cables or switchboards. Nobody yet fully understood how important that was. In 4 years, the United States Army would understand it completely. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the Army Signal Corps already had a relationship with Galvin Manufacturing. They had tested and purchased handy-talkies for training exercises. But the outbreak of full-scale global combat changed the scale of everything in ways that no one in that Chicago factory could have prepared for. The Army needed to communicate across jungles, beaches, and frozen mountains. It needed radios that worked under mortar fire, in tropical humidity, after being dropped from a truck or submerged in a river crossing. It needed radios that a 19-year-old soldier could operate without weeks of training, that a platoon leader could carry into a firefight without needing a technician beside him. Galvin Manufacturing delivered. The SCR-300 was the standard backpack radio of the American infantry, a 35-pound unit that provided clear voice communication over several miles in combat conditions. The SCR-536, smaller and truly handheld, became the iconic walkie-talkie of the war. The device photographed in the hands of officers storming Normandy beaches and island hopping across the Pacific. Galvin Manufacturing produced over 130,000 SCR-536 units during the war, along with communication equipment for tanks, aircraft, ships, and forward command posts. In 1940, Galvin Manufacturing had annual revenues of approximately $5 million and fewer than 1,000 employees. By 1944, revenues were $80 million and the workforce had grown to over 9,000 people. That is 16 times growth in 4 years. Paul Galvin spent the war years dividing his time between the factory floor and the Pentagon, negotiating contracts and managing logistics for an operation that had transformed from a small manufacturer of consumer electronics into a producer of critical military communications hardware. Then he also began thinking about what came after the war. The war was teaching America something about electronics that peacetime had kept abstract. Soldiers who had operated SCR-300s in the mountains of Italy or the forests of Germany came home knowing that radio communication was not a luxury. It was infrastructure, as fundamental as roads. Cities were wiring themselves for communication in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1935. And in 1945, Paul Galvin saw a prototype television set. He understood immediately. The same instinct that had told him in 1929 that car radios could be cheap enough for working families looked at a television screen and saw every living room in America. He told his engineers to build the cheapest television set possible. They delivered in 1947. The Golden View, a 7-inch black and white set, sold for $179.95. Every other television on the market cost at least $300. The Golden View sold out immediately. In that same year, Paul Galvin officially renamed the company after its most famous product. Galvin Manufacturing Corporation became Motorola, Inc. Motorola shipped 100,000 television sets in its first year of production. By 1950, Motorola was the third largest television manufacturer in the country, behind only RCA and Zenith. Paul Galvin was 52 years old. He had survived bankruptcy, the Depression, and a world war. He had named the company after a product he invented in a parking lot and built it into a corporation that employed tens of thousands of Americans and put communication technology in their cars and living rooms. He did not rest. He never learned how. By 1950, Motorola occupied a position that very few American companies achieved in the post-war economy. It was not simply a manufacturer. It was an innovator of infrastructure. The television division produced 100,000 sets a year from a plant in Franklin Park, Illinois. The two-way radio division equipped police departments, fire departments, taxi companies, and construction firms across the country with the first reliable communication systems those industries had ever used. The car radio business, the original product, the thing that started everything, was still growing, installed in millions of new automobiles rolling off Detroit assembly lines. Paul Galvin ran the company with what employees described as a combination of absolute authority and genuine curiosity. He walked the factory floor every day. He knew machinists by name. He held meetings that started at 7 in the morning. He had a temper that could clear a conference room and standards that were, in the language of the era, impossible to satisfy. The succession question had a clear answer. His son, Robert W. Galvin, had joined the company in 1940 at age 18, worked every division from the inside, and been promoted steadily through the management structure. In 1954, Paul named Robert vice president. In 1956, following a series of health setbacks, he moved himself to the chairman role and handed the CEO title to his son. Robert was 34 years old. What he brought to the role that his father had not was a theory of corporate management. Distributed decision-making, where divisions operated with significant autonomy and competed with each other for resources, produced better innovation than centralized command. The first major test case was semiconductors. The transistor had been invented at Bell Labs in 1947. By the mid-1950s, a race was on to turn theoretical physics into practical, manufacturable electronics. In 1955, Motorola produced their first commercial transistor. In 1958, they opened a semiconductor manufacturing facility in Phoenix, Arizona, a decision that separated Motorola from the consumer electronics companies it competed with. RCA made televisions. Zenith made televisions. Motorola was building the capability to make the components inside everything else. Paul Galvin died on November 5, 1959. He was 64 years old. The obituaries called him the father of American mobile communications, a title that history would validate more fully than anyone present at his death could have understood. The company he founded with $565 was generating $270 million in annual revenues. His funeral in Chicago drew executives, engineers, workers from the factory floor, and police chiefs from a dozen cities whose departments ran on Motorola radios. He never saw the cellular phone. He never saw the Schaumburg campus his son would build. He left behind a company, a culture, and a name. What happened to all three is the actual story. Robert W. Galvin served as CEO from 1956 to 1986, 30 years at the controls of an institution his father had built from nothing. During that period, he did something genuinely rare in American business. He made his father's company substantially more innovative than his father had made it, while growing it from a mid-sized manufacturer into a global technology corporation operating on 5 continents. The key to Robert Galvin's Motorola is the word decentralization. Where Paul had run the company as an extension of his own judgment, his factory floor instincts, his personal relationships, his relentless physical presence, Robert built a structure where divisions competed with each other, where engineers were funded to pursue ideas that had no guaranteed commercial return, and where failure was treated as information rather than catastrophe. This philosophy produced the Motorola Semiconductor division, which by the mid-1960s was producing integrated circuits for NASA's Apollo program. Motorola's transponders were on every Apollo spacecraft. The communication system that carried Neil Armstrong's words from the surface of the moon to Earth on July 20th, 1969, was built in Schaumburg. The lunar surface television camera that broadcast those images to 600 million viewers around the planet was a Motorola product. The company's technology was not merely a component in the Apollo program. It was the program's ability to tell the story of itself to the world. The space program contracts established Motorola's institutional reputation in ways that no advertising budget could buy. By the early 1970s, the government electronics division dominated American law enforcement and emergency communications. By 1973, $1.2 billion in annual revenue, 40,000 employees. In 1976, Robert Galvin commissioned a new corporate headquarters on 77 acres in Schaumburg, Illinois, a suburb 25 miles northwest of downtown Chicago. The Schaumburg campus was designed to be permanent, not an office park, but an institutional declaration of scale and ambition. The main building was 900,000 square feet. By the early 1980s, the campus had expanded to multiple buildings totaling over 2 million square feet. Research laboratories, manufacturing facilities, cafeterias serving thousands daily. 25,000 people worked at the Schaumburg campus at its peak. Across the Chicago metropolitan area, Motorola employed over 35,000 Illinoisans. The suburb of Schaumburg, which had been a farming community of fewer than 1,000 people in 1960, grew to a suburb of 75,000 by 2000, driven in significant part by Motorola's presence and the supply chain and service businesses that gathered around it. But the most important thing happening at Motorola in the 1970s wasn't happening in Schaumburg. It was happening on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan. On April 3, 1973, a Motorola engineer named Martin Cooper stood at 6th Avenue and 53rd Street in New York City and made a phone call. He called Joel Engel, the head of cellular research at AT&T's Bell Laboratories. He said, "Joel, I'm calling you from a cellular phone, a real cellular phone, a portable handheld cellular phone." The device in Cooper's hand weighed 2.5 pounds. It was 9 inches tall without the antenna. It offered 30 minutes of battery life before requiring 10 hours of recharge. The Cooper was making the call specifically to his most serious rival. AT&T Bell Labs had been developing cellular communication technology for years and believed they would be first to demonstrate a portable unit. Motorola had beaten them. The call to Engel was not a courtesy. It was a declaration. The gap between the 1973 demonstration and a commercial product, exactly 10 years. The Dynatac 8000X received Federal Communications Commission approval on September 21, 1983. It weighed 1.75 pounds, stood 13 inches tall with the antenna extended, offered 30 minutes of talk time and 8 hours of standby, and sold for $3,995, the equivalent of approximately $12,000 today. Motorola sold every unit they could produce. Then people waited on lists for months for the privilege of paying nearly $4,000 to carry a 13-inch telephone. Motorola had not entered a new market. They had created a market. Robert Galvin understood, and this is what distinguishes him as a strategist, that the luxury market was the first chapter, not the story. The price curve for consumer electronics always bent downward. Within a decade, what cost $4,000 would cost $400. Within 2 decades, $40. The question was not whether cellular phones would become affordable to everyone. The question was who would be ready with the manufacturing scale, the carrier relationships, and the technology depth when they did. Motorola invested hundreds of millions of dollars through the 1980s in cellular infrastructure, miniaturization research, and manufacturing capacity. The MicroTac in 1989 was the world's smallest cellular phone at the time, a genuine engineering achievement that sold millions of units and confirmed Motorola's position as the dominant brand in a market accelerating toward mass consumer adoption. In 1989, Motorola reported $9.6 billion in annual revenues and 99,000 employees worldwide. They were the dominant brand in cellular handsets, in two-way radios, and in embedded microprocessors. The Motorola 68000 chip was the brain of the original Apple Macintosh, launched in 1984. Robert Galvin retired as CEO in 1986, handing day-to-day management to George Fisher while remaining as board chairman. His final institutional legacy was a quality management initiative called Six Sigma, a statistical methodology for reducing manufacturing defects to near zero through rigorous measurement and process analysis. Motorola developed and formalized Six Sigma in 1986, winning the first Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award in 1988. General Electric's Jack Welch later adopted Six Sigma as GE's primary quality framework and made it famous across American manufacturing. It is one of the most broadly influential management innovations in American industrial history, and it originated in the effort to make Motorola's factories produce flawless electronics at high volume. Robert stepped back from the chairman role in 1990. He was 68 years old. The company his father had built with $565 was generating nearly $10 billion in annual revenue and employed 100,000 people on 5 continents. The next 30 years would test whether Motorola's institutional structure, the decentralized divisions, the engineering culture, the industrial identity built around hardware communication, could survive the transition from the hardware age to the software age. It could not. But before the fall, there was one more season of glory. 1994 is the year to mark on the timeline. Every number is at its maximum. Every indicator points forward. 1994 is the last year when everything at Motorola makes sense at once. Revenue, $22 billion. Employees worldwide, 132,000. Global cellular handset market share, approximately 32%. It's nearly 1 in 3 cellular phones sold anywhere on Earth was a Motorola. The pager business, which Motorola had effectively pioneered since the 1950s, evolving from simple numeric beepers to sophisticated alphanumeric devices that could receive short messages, was generating substantial revenue with high margins. At the peak, an estimated 60 million Motorola pagers were in active use in the United States alone. Hospitals, construction crews, logistics companies, and the entire American drug distribution infrastructure depended on them to coordinate operations. The semiconductor division was producing the PowerPC chip in a joint venture with Apple and IBM. The government electronics and two-way radio businesses were equipping not just American law enforcement, but police forces and military communications units on 6 continents. Every time an emergency dispatcher anywhere in the country pressed a transmit button to reach a patrol car, the probability was high that the radio infrastructure carrying that message had been built by Motorola. George Fisher had left Motorola in 1993 to become CEO of Eastman Kodak. Gary Tooker became CEO at Motorola, a steady, experienced operational manager who knew the company's existing businesses with genuine depth. The problem with operational excellence at a company facing an existential transition is that it optimizes for the present. It makes the existing machine run more efficiently. It is exactly the wrong set of skills. For the moment when the machine needs to be fundamentally replaced, the existential transition was the shift from analog to digital cellular. All analog cellular networks transmitted voice as continuous radio waves. Digital networks converted voice to binary data. Digital was clearer, more secure, and critically capable of carrying not just voice, but text and eventually data of every kind. Analog was a highway for one type of vehicle. Digital was a highway that could carry anything. Europe had already made the choice. The Global System for Mobile Communications, GSM, had been standardized across European networks in 1991. By 1994, European consumers were buying GSM handsets by the millions. Nokia, a Finnish conglomerate that had been primarily a rubber boot and paper manufacturer a decade earlier, had committed early to GSM infrastructure and handset manufacturing. And Nokia arrived at the digital transition with no analog business to protect, and no existing customers telling them what they already needed. In the United States, the transition was messier. 2 competing digital standards were fighting for market dominance. CDMA, backed by Qualcomm and the infant Sprint cellular network, and TDMA, backed by AT&T Motorola, with massive sunk investment in analog network equipment and deep relationships with American carriers who had built profitable businesses on Motorola's analog infrastructure, resisted committing aggressively to either standard. The internal debate is documented in accounts from executives who were present. The reluctance was not ignorance. Motorola's engineers understood digital's trajectory. They ran the projections for GSM adoption. They understood what was happening in Europe. The problem was incentive structure. Every dollar invested in digital risked cannibalizing analog revenue that was still growing. The American carrier relationships were telling Motorola's salespeople they did not need GSM handsets. Motorola listened to its existing customers rather than to the market forming behind them. Nokia had no existing customers. Nokia was building fresh. By 1997, Nokia had displaced Motorola as the world's largest cellular handset manufacturer, a position Motorola had held since it created the product. Motorola's global handset market share in 1995, 30%. In 1998, 18%. In 2000, 13%. That is not a competitive decline. That is a market rendering a verdict. The human scale of what that verdict meant inside the Schaumburg campus deserves to be understood. Yes, the engineers who had built the walkie-talkies and the Dynatac had expected to retire from the same company with the same pension they had been promised. Middle managers had moved their families from Chicago to Schaumburg specifically because Motorola offered stability, the kind of corporate permanence that American manufacturing had promised for 40 years. The Six Sigma culture that Robert Galvin institutionalized had created a particular kind of employee, rigorous, process-oriented, trained to measure everything and improve incrementally. Six Sigma produced world-class quality in the products Motorola already knew how to make. What it did not produce was the organizational agility required to abandon a successful product category and reinvent the company from the ground up. When the layoffs began in earnest, 20,000 jobs cut in Christopher Galvin's first restructuring in 1998, then 30,000 more between 2001 and 2003. The people who left were not abstract units of labor. They were the machinists who had come from high school in the 1970s. They were the engineers who had moved their families to Schaumburg for the stability, the pension obligations from those workers, the commitments Motorola had made to people who spent careers inside the institution, survived the layoffs as ongoing liabilities in a company whose financial capacity to meet them was deteriorating. The pager business had its own arc. At its 1994 peak, it generated $600 million in annual revenue. By 1998, cellular phones were becoming capable of receiving pages directly, all rendering the standalone pager redundant for most users. By 2005, pager sales had collapsed to under $100 million, and the division served only hospitals and specialized industrial users. The product that had seemed as permanent as any communications infrastructure was gone in less than a decade, eliminated by the cellular phone that Motorola itself had created. Paul Galvin's company killed its own product line. In a different kind of story, that would be the irony. In this story, it is merely the prologue. In January 1996, Motorola launched the StarTAC, and for a brief, brilliant moment, it looked like the digital transition didn't matter. The StarTAC was the world's first clamshell mobile phone, a device that folded in half like a communicator from a science fiction series. It weighed 3.1 ounces, all less than half the weight of competing handsets. It was marketed not just as a phone, but as a status object, an accessory, something you chose the way you chose a watch. Motorola sold 4 million StarTAC units in the first year. The phone dominated the premium cellular market through 1996 and into 1997. Executives carried it. Celebrities photographed with it. The StarTAC was Motorola's greatest industrial design achievement up to that point. It was also, in its success, a distraction. The phone ran on analog networks. The premium it commanded was based entirely on hardware design innovation. The fold, the weight, the finish. It had nothing to say about software user experience, nothing to contribute to the digital ecosystem that Nokia was building systematically in Europe. The StarTAC was a masterpiece of the analog era. It was arriving precisely as the analog era was ending. The cellular carriers rolling out digital networks in 1997 were signing infrastructure contracts with Nokia for GSM equipment and recommending Nokia handsets to subscribers who wanted digital service. Motorola's relationship with the American carriers was deep and genuine, built over 15 years, but it could not survive the carriers' operational decision that their futures were in digital, and Nokia had the products Motorola was still developing. Nokia was not simply selling better phones. Nokia had built a software platform for its handsets that was noticeably simpler to navigate and more reliable than Motorola's menu-driven systems. Nokia's product lines had a coherence. A consumer who bought a Nokia in 1996 and then bought a different Nokia in 1998 found the same logic in a new package. Motorola's product lines during the same period were fragmented across multiple form factors, multiple interface systems, and software approaches that hadn't been unified into a coherent consumer experience. The StarTAC was brilliant in hardware. The software behind the hardware was an afterthought. The lesson of the StarTAC, in retrospect, is that hardware excellence is necessary, but not sufficient in a market that is becoming a software competition. Before Christopher Galvin's story, Before the fall that everyone eventually witnessed, there is a project that illustrates a specific quality of Motorola's late 1980s ambition. Too large, too expensive, all are too certain of its own brilliance and built on an assumption about the future that the future refused to confirm. The project was called Iridium. It was conceived in 1987 by Motorola engineer Barry Bertiger, whose wife had complained about not being able to reach him by phone while vacationing in the Bahamas. Bertiger's response was characteristic of the Motorola engineering culture at its peak. If the existing cellular infrastructure couldn't reach everywhere, build new infrastructure that reached everywhere. He proposed a constellation of 66 low Earth orbit satellites that would provide cellular telephone service to every point on the surface of the Earth. No exceptions, no dependence on ground-based tower networks. The pitch to management was compelling in 1990. As developing countries that might take decades to build terrestrial cellular systems would have global coverage from day one. Remote locations, oil rigs, jungle research stations, ships at sea, would have the same connectivity as Midtown Manhattan. Motorola committed to the project in 1990. The initial cost estimate was $3.4 billion. 66 satellites were designed, fabricated, and launched between 1997 and 1998 in the most ambitious private satellite deployment in history up to that point. The engineering achievement of putting 66 precision spacecraft into coordinated low Earth orbit on commercial budgets was genuine and significant. Total project cost by launch, $5 billion. The first Iridium call was made on November 1, 1998. The handset weighed nearly 1 pound. It required line of sight to the sky. It did not function inside buildings or in the urban canyons of Manhattan, and cost $3,000. Service plans ran $5 to $14 per minute. By November 1998, a standard Nokia handset weighed less than 6 ounces, worked perfectly well indoors, and required no particular orientation to receive a signal. Service plans in major American markets were approaching 15 cents per minute. Iridium had spent 11 years and $5 billion building a satellite network to solve a problem that terrestrial cellular was solving faster, cheaper, and better with every passing month. The assumption that drove the project, that terrestrial infrastructure would not reach remote and developing markets affordably within the project's investment horizon, had been invalidated by the actual pace of cellular network expansion, which was faster than Iridium's models had projected. The company filed for bankruptcy on August 13, 1999, 9 months after its first call. The entire satellite constellation was purchased out of bankruptcy for $25 million. A last-minute contract with the Department of Defense preserved the satellites for government use. The technology still operates today, primarily for military and maritime communications in areas beyond terrestrial coverage. It is useful. It is just not useful enough to justify $5 billion. Motorola's direct financial exposure in the Iridium project was estimated at $2.5 billion in losses and write-downs. The indirect costs, the management attention consumed by years of crisis management, the distraction from the digital transition that was simultaneously reshaping the core cellular business, were harder to quantify, but were real and lasting. Christopher B. Galvin had become CEO in January 1997. He was 46 years old. He was Paul Galvin's grandson and Robert Galvin's son. He inherited the name, the office, the campus, the employees, and the crisis. Christopher Galvin was not unprepared for the role. He had joined Motorola in 1973 at age 23, worked in multiple divisions across 24 years, and understood the company's operations with the depth that only a career spent inside an institution can provide. What he inherited in 1997 was a company showing the first signs of structural illness that the revenue numbers had been concealing. In his first year, Christopher Galvin launched a restructuring. He cut 20,000 jobs globally. He reorganized divisions and announced strategic initiatives around digital technology. The stock market responded positively. Revenue in 1997 hit $29.8 billion, the highest in company history. It was the last time revenue would reach that level. The digital transition required more than different phones. It required an entire ecosystem: operating systems, software platforms, carrier certification processes, a governing philosophy for how users interacted with the device. And Nokia had spent the 1990s building this ecosystem with focused intensity, iterating through handset designs with a speed and consumer orientation that Motorola's hardware-centric engineering culture struggled to match. Internal accounts from executives present at Motorola during the late 1990s describe strategy meetings where engineers acknowledged Nokia was years ahead in software user experience. Sessions where the question of which digital standards to prioritize produced debate without decisive resolution. Consumer research reports showing customers preferred Nokia interfaces, with no clear institutional consensus on what to do about it. In early 2000, Motorola's stock reached approximately $60 per share. By mid-2002, it had fallen to around $10. 31,000 jobs had been eliminated since 2001. And revenue that had peaked at $29.8 billion in 1997 had fallen to $23.1 billion and was declining further. At a shareholder meeting in May 2003, the collapse in share value was the unavoidable subject. Investors who had held Motorola stock at its 2000 peak had watched 80% of their investment disappear. Christopher Galvin resigned on September 19, 2003. The dynasty that had run Galvin Manufacturing and then Motorola for 75 consecutive years ended on a Friday morning in September 2003. The board hired Ed Zander as CEO in January 2004. He came from Sun Microsystems and was the first CEO in Motorola's history, with no connection to the Galvin family. This was deliberate. The board needed someone who could see Motorola from outside its own institutional self-image. Zander arrived at a company that still had substantial assets. The two-way radio and government communications businesses were profitable. The cellular handset business was struggling, but not destroyed. Motorola still employed 97,000 people worldwide. He understood immediately that the company needed a product, not a strategy document, not a restructuring plan, but something physical that would reestablish Motorola's identity in the consumer market, something that made people stop and look. His engineers had been working on something since before Zander arrived. The development of what became the Razr Phi 3 had begun under Christopher Galvin's tenure. A team led by Roger Jellicoe had been exploring the question of what the thinnest possible flip phone would look like if you made it from aircraft-grade aluminum instead of plastic, and in using manufacturing techniques borrowed from the aerospace industry. The phone was designed from the outside in, starting with the physical form and working backward to the engineering, which was the reverse of how Motorola had historically approached product development. The Motorola Razr V3 launched in November 2004. At 13.9 millimeters thick, it was the thinnest cellular phone in the world. Its body was milled from a single block of aluminum. The keypad was laser-etched directly into the metal surface. It folded closed with a satisfying, precise action that made every other flip phone on the market feel soft and imprecise by comparison. It was the most beautiful cell phone ever made up to that point. Arguably, more than 20 years later, still one of the most beautiful cell phones ever made. Zander had projected lifetime sales of 50 million units. They sold 50 million in the first 2 years. Total Razr Phi 3 sales across all variants eventually exceeded 130 million units. In 2006, Motorola's share of the American cellular handset market climbed to 22%, the strongest position the company had held in years. Revenue grew. The stock price recovered from single digits to over $25. Ed Zander gave an interview during this period, flush with the Razr's success, where he asked rhetorically, "What does Nokia do?" He was describing the problem. He just didn't know it yet. The Razr was a feature phone, extraordinarily beautiful, mechanically refined, commercially successful on a scale that few consumer products achieve. But the competition that would actually determine Motorola's future was not about the physical design of the device. It was about what happened on the screen, what ecosystems surrounded the screen, and whether the thing in your pocket was a communication device or a computer. In Cupertino, California, a team working under near total secrecy since 2004 was building the answer to a question nobody had publicly asked yet. January 9, 2007, the Moscone Center, San Francisco, Macworld Conference. Steve Jobs walked onto the stage and told the audience he was going to show them three revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, a breakthrough internet communications device. He paused for the audience's speculation to build. "These are not three separate devices," he said. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone." The iPhone had no physical keyboard. Its entire face was a touch-sensitive screen that responded to finger pressure and movement in ways that existing touchscreen technology had never achieved. It ran a full web browser that rendered actual internet pages, not mobile-adapted versions. It ran a version of the operating system Apple had spent a decade refining for its desktop computers, adapted for a device that fit in a shirt pocket. The cellular phone industry had been organized around hardware competition for the entire 24 years of its commercial existence. Screen size, speaker quality, antenna performance, battery life, hinge mechanism, keypad layout. These were the axes on which phones competed, and Motorola had competed on all of them with sophistication and, now with the Razr, genuine excellence. What Jobs demonstrated on January 9th was a different axis entirely. The iPhone was not hardware with software running inside it. It was a software platform with hardware built around it. The value was in the ecosystem. The App Store, announced in March 2008, which allowed third-party developers to write applications and distribute them through a centralized marketplace Apple controlled and curated. By the end of 2008, the App Store had 10,000 applications. By 2010, 225,000. By 2012, 700,000. By 2014, over 1 million. Each application made the iPhone more valuable. Each additional user made the platform more attractive to developers. The ecosystem generated its own momentum in ways that no hardware product ever could. Motorola had no platform. They had devices. Motorola's market share in global cellular handsets fell from 14% in 2007 to 8% in 2008. Revenue from handsets collapsed. The stock fell from $21 in early 2007 to under $5 by late 2008. Ed Zander was removed as CEO in November 2007. He had rescued the company from one crisis with the Razr and delivered it to a larger one he hadn't anticipated. The succession planning at Motorola in late 2007 produced an arrangement that was, in its design, an admission of institutional bifurcation. Greg Brown became CEO of the Enterprise Mobility and Government Solutions divisions, the profitable legacy of Paul Galvin's walkie-talkie business. Sanjay Jha, recruited from Qualcomm, became co-CEO of the Consumer Mobile and Home division. The dual CEO structure acknowledged what almost nobody in Schaumburg was willing to say aloud. The company had two businesses with fundamentally incompatible institutional identities. The enterprise and government business was an industrial company in the tradition Paul Galvin had founded, hardware-focused, relationship-driven, serving customers with long-term contracts who valued reliability above all else. It had clear competitive advantages, stable margins, and a solid future. The consumer handset business was a software platform competition that Motorola had arrived at 20 years late, without the software engineering culture, without the application ecosystem, and without the vertical integration that Apple had built over a decade of deliberate preparation. Jha's answer was the Android strategy. Google had launched the Android mobile operating system in 2008, and it was rapidly becoming the alternative ecosystem to Apple's iOS for manufacturers who wanted to ship smartphones without building their own software platforms from scratch. Motorola partnered with Verizon and Google to launch the original Motorola Droid in November 2009, deliberately marketed as the anti-iPhone, featuring a physical keyboard, an open operating system, and advertising that directly contrasted its openness with Apple's closed ecosystem. The Droid sold 250,000 units in its first week. Verizon invested heavily in marketing it as the flagship of a competitive response to AT&T's exclusive iPhone partnership. For a moment, Motorola had found a path. The problem was Samsung. Samsung was pursuing the same strategy with significantly greater resources, greater manufacturing scale across the entire device spectrum from budget to premium, and the institutional flexibility that comes from being a massive conglomerate rather than a single product line manufacturer. In 2010, Samsung shipped 280 million handsets across all categories. Motorola shipped 38 million. The split into Motorola Mobility and Motorola Solutions in January 2011 was the honest institutional acknowledgement that the consumer device business and the enterprise communications business were not the same company anymore, had not been the same company for years, and could not be run effectively as one. The formal announcement of Google's acquisition of Motorola Mobility came on August 15, 2011. The price was $12.5 billion. At the time, the largest acquisition in Google's history. The strategic rationale centered on the patent portfolio. Motorola Mobility held approximately 17,000 patents covering cellular communication technologies, signal processing methods, compression algorithms, and physical device designs developed over 3 decades of engineering investment. In the smartphone era, where Apple had sued Samsung and other Android manufacturers for patent infringement, the portfolio was a defensive weapon worth a significant premium. What followed over the next 30 months was a case study in what happens when a software culture acquires a hardware culture without a clear theory for how to integrate them. Google operated with management principles built around software development, fast iteration, engineers with enormous autonomy, an organizational culture deliberately resistant to the kind of hierarchical authority that manufacturing operations require. Motorola engineers who expected Google's resources to fund an aggressive smartphone R&D program discovered that Google's investment priorities were organized around services that could scale to billions of users globally, not hardware facing intense margin pressure from Samsung and Apple. Between acquisition in August 2011 and divestiture in January 2014, Google restructured Motorola Mobility repeatedly. They cut 20,000 jobs, approximately half the workforce at the time of acquisition. They attempted and abandoned multiple smartphone product lines. They wrote down approximately $8 billion in Motorola-related charges. On January 29, 2014, Google announced the sale of Motorola Mobility to Lenovo for $2.91 billion. Google had paid $12.5 billion. The arithmetic, a $9.6 billion loss in 30 months. There is a conversation that industrial historians always have about stories like this one, and it sounds approximately like this. Was the failure preventable? Were the people making decisions in those Schaumburg conference rooms making choices that were obviously wrong, or choices that seemed rational at the time but turned out to be catastrophic? The honest answer is that most of the critical decisions were visible as risks at the moment they were made. The people in those conference rooms were not blind to the dangers. The GSM decision is the most clearly documented. Internal presentations from the early 1990s showed projections of European and global GSM adoption rates that were accurate. The decision to underinvest in GSM relative to Nokia was not made from ignorance. It was made from a calculation that aggressive GSM investment would cannibalize the analog revenue that was still growing in the American market, while the international revenues GSM would generate would require years to mature. The calculation was locally rational. A financial officer doing the analysis in 1993, looking at Motorola's actual revenue streams and projected timelines for GSM market development, could have made the same recommendation. The problem is that locally rational decisions made by large incumbents facing new technology consistently produce the same outcome. The new technology grows faster than the incumbents' models predicted. The markets that seemed safely analog transition sooner than expected. And the company that chose to protect present revenue discovers it no longer has a credible path to future revenue. Kodak's management ran the same calculation with digital photography in the late 1970s. Film was profitable. Digital was theoretical. Protecting film was rational. Kodak filed for bankruptcy in January 2012. The Iridium commitment is harder to defend. The core thesis, that terrestrial cellular networks would not reach remote and developing markets affordably within the project's investment horizon, was testable against available data by the mid-1990s. And terrestrial cellular was expanding faster than Iridium's models had assumed. Concerns raised by engineers within Motorola during the project's development were documented and not acted upon. The smartphone transition failure is the most complex. Motorola produced smartphones before the iPhone. The devices existed and worked. What they lacked was the platform strategy, the understanding that the value of a smartphone was not in the hardware, but in the software ecosystem surrounding the hardware, and that building that ecosystem required a different kind of institutional capability than Motorola had ever developed. Apple had spent years building that capability in deliberate secrecy. Motorola spent those years trying to produce the best possible hardware for a competitive landscape that Apple was about to redefine. The people who made these decisions were not fools. They were executives of large, successful industrial companies, facing the structural pressures that large, successful industrial companies reliably face. They were, in Clayton Christensen's language, practicing the innovator's dilemma at institutional scale. Christensen published the book describing this exact pattern in 1997, while Motorola was living it in real time. This is neither absolution nor indictment. It is simply what happened. The Motorola Schaumburg campus at its peak functioned as a small city, cafeterias serving breakfast and lunch for 25,000 daily visitors, medical facilities, fitness centers, a daycare center, a credit union, security patrols, maintenance crews, a facilities management operation comparable in scale to a small municipal government, all at the campus's 1994 peak. Approximately 25,000 employees on site. After the 2003 restructuring, approximately 15,000. After the 2007 to 2008 collapse and reorganization, approximately 10,000. After the 2011 split, approximately 6,000. After Google's acquisition and 2012 to 2013 restructuring, approximately 3,500. The buildings didn't disappear immediately. They emptied first. Dark in the evenings, when they had once blazed with engineers working late. Parking lots that had filled at 7 in the morning in 1994 had large vacant sections by 2012. Between 2016 and 2020, the redevelopment of the campus proceeded. Motorola Solutions consolidated its operations into a smaller building footprint. Several major buildings were demolished. Where engineers once designed the Dynatac and the StarTac and the Razor, there are now apartments, restaurants, and retail stores. The local businesses that grew around the campus, the restaurants along Gulf Road that served thousands of employees at lunch, contracted alongside it. The village of Schaumburg's tax revenue from Motorola's campus properties peaked in the mid-1990s and declined steadily thereafter. The community survived, absorbing the loss through fee adjustments, service reductions, and the gradual replacement of Motorola's tax contribution with revenues from commercial redevelopment. Schaumburg is not Gary, Indiana. The suburb that grew around Motorola's campus did not die when Motorola left it, but it is fundamentally different from what it was. What remains of Motorola in 2024 exists in 3 distinct forms. Motorola Solutions, headquartered in Chicago's Merchandise Mart District, following a 2019 relocation from Schaumburg, reported $9.7 billion in revenue in 2023 and employs approximately 21,000 people worldwide. It is the direct institutional descendant of Paul Galvin's walkie-talkie business, the company that equips public safety agencies with communication systems, that makes the radios in police cars and fire stations and the command centers that coordinate emergency responses. In 2023, Motorola Solutions supplied communication infrastructure for over 100,000 government and public safety customers in over 100 countries. It is a viable, profitable industrial company doing exactly what it always did. Motorola Mobility, as a Lenovo subsidiary, continues to design and sell Android smartphones under the Motorola brand. The Moto G series phones compete primarily in the value segment, priced between $150 and $300. They are sold in Walmart and Target and online. They do not carry the institutional weight of the brand they bear. The patent portfolio that Google acquired with Motorola Mobility in 2012 provided the defensive coverage it was purchased to provide. Industry analysts have estimated the value generated by those patents to Google's Android ecosystem ran to several billion dollars in litigation costs avoided. A partial explanation for why a $9.6 billion net loss was, from one angle, a defensible business decision. Martin Cooper, the engineer who made that first phone call in Manhattan in 1973, was 95 years old in 2024. He gives interviews regularly and has expressed measured concern about the addictive design of smartphones, the devices that are, in the deepest sense, the technological grandchildren of the Dynatak he demonstrated on that sidewalk. The man who proved cellular communication was possible worries about what cellular communication has become. Robert W. Galvin died on October 11, 2011, at 89 years old. He saw the Razr. He saw the iPhone's launch. He saw the announcement of the Google acquisition 3 months before he died. There is a photograph in the archives of the Schaumburg Public Library taken at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Motorola World Headquarters in 1976. Paul Galvin had been dead for 17 years. Robert Galvin stands at the podium in a dark suit, a ceremonial shovel in both hands. Illinois farmland stretching behind him. He is 54 years old. The campus that will rise from that cornfield will employ 25,000 people at its peak. It will produce the technology that changed how humanity communicates. He is smiling. He cannot see what happens to it. Nobody in that photograph can. That is always the tragedy and the dignity of people who build things. They make what they can see from where they stand. They leave behind something larger than themselves, which is then inherited by a world that sees differently, wants different things, and moves at a different speed. The Dynatak's direct descendants are in the pockets of 5 billion human beings today. The patents Motorola filed between 1973 and 2011, the intellectual architecture underlying cellular communication as it exists today, were acquired by Google for $12.5 billion and used to defend the Android ecosystem that runs on approximately 2/3 of the smartphones currently in service on Earth. And somewhere in Illinois, a police officer's radio, standard issue, black, clipped to a shoulder, crackles with a transmission, clear, immediate, perfectly intelligible. The way Paul Galvin wanted every voice to travel. His name is on it. If you've been with this story from the beginning, you already know which industrial empire you want to see next. Leave it in the comments. There are 1,000 monuments still standing, still emptying, still waiting for someone to explain what they were.